Hey everybody, it's Brian Burns. Welcome to this episode of the Brutal Truth About Sales and Selling podcast. Today I got Bob Apollo on. I'm going to be talking about the sales process and how sometimes it just isn't as neat and linear as we wish. And that's kind of like life, isn't it? So we're going to get into the details of it. But before we do, I want to make sure you understand the classes are just cooking. I've been putting on a customer testimonial at the very end, and I'll be describing and giving you the frequently answered questions at the very end of the podcast to give you some insight into how people are leveraging it, how they work, and the results that you can get. And you can always schedule a time to talk to me at b2brevenue.com. Right under the training, there's a link to my calendar. It's to talk about the classes, not your career or deal or anything, to see if they're a perfect match for you or not. Please check out the table of contents first to see if it fits, and at least listen to at least 5 episodes of the podcast. Because if the podcast makes sense, if what I'm talking about sounds a lot like what you're up against, then the courses will make sense. So let's get into the interview, and make sure you're checking out Co-Video. Co-Video is the way I'm crushing it with email now. They've got a Chrome plugin that's super powerful. You're going to love it. covideo.com. Check it out. Hey, Bob, thanks for joining us today. As a way of getting started, tell us about yourself.
Well, Brian, thank you for inviting me to come on the program. I'm Bob Apollo. I run a UK-based sales and marketing consultancy called Inflection Point. And we've got a particular focus on helping clients to really master the challenges and opportunities of value-based selling.
How'd you get interested in this?
Well, you know, it's really been an interest for some time. I've been 40 years in sales and marketing. I actually spent my formative years at Hewlett-Packard in the days when it was universally regarded as a sort of an exemplary company. And they really established a number of foundational elements of how I continue to think about these things. They, for example, recognize that selling isn't just an art, and it isn't actually just an art or a science. It's actually art, science, and a bit of what you might call engineering. And being clear about value and trying to craft and create value in a structured way has been something that sort of intrigued me from way back, from a time when, you know, if you were to look around, the primary mode of operation in technology sales was to attempt to present how fast, how sophisticated, how capable your product was, and to compete with other vendors on those axes.
And I'm very familiar with HP. I haven't worked there, but my first serious enterprise sales job, it was 80% HP salespeople. I worked for one. I worked with them. And I think they had to have a better sales approach because they were not the king of the jungle.
Sure.
Right.
You know, sometimes when you're the challenger rather than the top dog, you have to be smarter. And you know, it's a thing I see reflected very much today. Most of the companies, the clients I work with, I help with their value selling, are scale-up companies, post-startup, but not yet corporate. And sometimes they find themselves competing with corporates. And actually, sometimes they find themselves tempted to recruit salespeople who've been very successful in a big corporate environment, with a very well-established brand. And that becomes a very interesting learning curve because you've talked about, not being top dog, having to work harder. Well, actually, I think one of the challenges for somebody who's lived or worked in a major branded corporate environment coming into a company that's perhaps on more of a growth curve but is not yet well established is that you don't have the umbrella of that brand, of that reputation, of that customer base, to shelter underneath. Yeah. And you're absolutely forced to, work a lot harder at articulating your value and your company's differentiation because, there isn't a big marketing department and there isn't 10 years of history that's already established it for you.
Yeah, and they don't know who you are or what you do. And, I've gone through this several times, starting at a startup and then getting acquired by a huge company. And I've seen the mistake that you've mentioned where they hire somebody from a gorilla and they come in and try and sell this brand new thing and they have no idea how to do it.
Yeah, the gorilla turns out to be a baboon.
Yes. They're like, where are the leads? Where are our accounts? Hey, you wrote a great post on the non-linearness of the large B2B sale.
Yeah.
What motivated you to do that?
Well, most of the time when I write these articles, it's stimulated by some direct experience working with one or a number of clients. And that was certainly true in this situation. And actually, it's not so much the non-linear world of B2B selling. It's the non-linear world of B2B buying that, if we're to be serious about being successful in complex business-to-business sales, we've got to master that. And actually, I think one of the visuals I plugged in to the article came from a Gartner piece, which attempted to just visualize, the non-linear complexity of what goes on inside corporate buying decisions. And of course, they aren't the first to do that. If you think about what some of the important things that were published in the Challenger sale or the Challenger customer, more accurately, a few years back, that also reflected on, the inherent complexity of trying to get decisions made when you've got a lot of stakeholders involved. In fact, I think they concluded that the more stakeholders you had, the chances of them coming to any sort of consensus to action, never mind by you, declined with every incremental new stakeholder that came into the equation.
And that's it. And too many companies just have the opposite view of it. It's the, qualify, give a presentation, give a demo, give the proposal, negotiate, close. Isn't that how it works?
Well, that's a very fine and simple theory, right? In fact, I wrote another article recently stimulated by something that Mike Bosworth had said years ago, the author of Solution Selling. And he conjured up a phrase, I think a very resonant phrase, called premature elaboration. And what he meant by that was the habit, really reflecting what you've just said, of salespeople responding as soon as they hear a need that they know they can satisfy or believe they can satisfy, to be able to resist the itch to pitch and to go into selling mode. When, as I think any of us who've run, large sales teams know, it's really the discovery phase that is the pivotal foundation. And if we rush discovery, if we sort of blast past really working out what's going on in the company and our urgency to try and make a proposal, we almost inevitably miss some really, really valuable stuff.
And how much of this is kind of emotional intelligence to kind of understand and empathize with the customer and understand what they have to do or even know what they have to do? So many reps I talk to have no idea how a company buys.
Yeah, I think that is a challenge, even for experienced salespeople. And it's certainly, I think, a challenge for somebody who's new to the business of complex sales in a technology or other related environment. Sometimes the truth of the matter is we're talking to somebody who appears to be a potential champion for us, and they themselves don't know how to navigate a successful purchasing process through their own organization. So I think emotional intelligence is certainly part of it, but I think there's also a very strong element of business acumen or business intelligence that's required, or certainly very helpful if you want to perform at the top of your game.
And how do you take your clients through this process? I mean, because if I was your client, I would feel like, oh, you're telling me it's a lot harder than I thought it was?
Well, so here's the thing, and I think this is probably true when they themselves are trying to sell to a potential customer, it's an awful lot easier to start the sales process if the buyer already has a feeling that maybe something isn't working quite as well as they would like it to work. So, if I'm targeting potential clients, I certainly want to find out early on whether these potential challenges resonate with them. If they don't think they have a problem, and if on exploring, some of the trends, if on telling a few stories, if on sharing a few insights, you don't get that early resonance, it may well be that they're just not a particularly good candidate. So I'd like to try and push against a door that is at least, partially open when it comes to working with clients. And a lot of them will recognize things like our revenue forecasts are unpredictable. Yeah. Our sales cycles keep getting extended. We keep getting surprised when deals don't close on their anticipated close date. That deals appear to get stuck in the process. Back to what Neil Rackham referred to in Spin, he sort of made a distinction between continuations and advances. So, I get a lot of continuations in my deal, but they're not actually moving forward. Some other indicators might be, we've hired some new salespeople and they're just not ramping up quickly enough. We've taught them all about the product and they're still not, meeting our expectations in terms of pipeline building or even more importantly, converting pipeline to close deals. So I think I'd rather, and there are a bunch of them out there, so I don't really need to create the problem. I'd rather look for companies who've either got the problem or got the symptoms. And that's absolutely part of what I'd coach clients to do as well.
Yeah, because I think it's pretty classic that getting user buyers excited about a new technology or product or something that makes their life enhanced, their productivity, the quality of their life, the predictability of it. But then they have to find the economic justification for it and present that to people who don't understand why they need this. And there's no class that they've taken on how to spend the company's money.
No. And yet we look at them, if we're not very smart about this, and interpret their enthusiasm as being, well, they're going to be absolutely able to convey that enthusiasm to their colleagues in a way which will persuade them. Yeah. And definitely not a very safe assumption. But, there's also some psychology in this as well. You talked about emotional intelligence. I think there's buying psychology at play in many of these situations. And I was very much taken by a handful of conclusions that Daniel Kahneman, who wrote Thinking Fast and Slow, came to. And one of them being companies and decision makers are more motivated, are more likely to commit an investment if they believe it will prevent a loss, rather than if they're doing it simply in the hope of a future gain. Yeah. So I think one of the tricks here, tricks is the wrong word, one of the techniques is to look for the sort of negative cost and consequences of sticking with the status quo, and not just the positive benefits of buying my solution. And I think that's, from my observations, I'm very interested in yours, where a lot of these things sort of fall down. Firstly, there's a bunch of, let's look at it manifested in proposals, if you will. There's a bunch of proposals out there that don't even really satisfactorily address the return on investment question. But even amongst that group, that subset of proposals, so at least make a stab at dealing with ROI, and preferably an ROI projection that's previously been agreed with the customer. A far fewer proportion of proposals actually talk to the issue of why change is necessary in the first place. And yet, back to our challenge of having a champion who needs to sell the idea of change to their colleagues, if they can't sell why sticking with the status quo is dangerous, then again their chances of getting their colleagues to, emotionally buy in as well as rationally buy in to the need for change is very much reduced.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I think what happens is salespeople fall into that happy ears trap of that end user buyer being excited, wanting to do it, and telling the rep what the rep wants to hear so that they can get what they want to get, which is a trial or a proof of concept, and then a quote, which I think is the death knell of the complex sale for the exact reasons you described.
Yeah, and a quote can mean a number of things. So one of the challenges in complex sales is, bowing to pressure to give a price quote early on in the cycle before you've established value. That's certainly a challenge, or delivering a proposal that doesn't reflect a really well developed discovery process where you really understand what the issues are, what the underlying causes are, what the consequences are, and so on. So jumping to quote. Now I think it works in companies that have set themselves up to be very good at, and there are a number of SaaS applications I can think of, particularly ones that don't require a great deal of integration, with other corporate systems, where understanding the price point actually can be quite important early on. But if you've got a complex solution whose value depends on the nature of the problem you're solving, you really need to understand the cost of the problem before you can confidently provide an indication of what it'll cost to solve it.
That's it, because I think what happens internally is that the end user buyer just forwards that quote, which is basically a list of line items with a cost on it, to their manager, and says it's a great idea.
So this is an absolutely classic case of you need to understand people's motivations before you respond to them. So why are they asking for the quote? Are they asking for the quote basically because they're in the position that you've just summarized, Are they asking for the quote because they've actually done a fair bit of research into your solution, sometimes unbeknownst to you, and are trying to work out whether it's possible to build a business case? We really need to understand the motivations behind the question, and not just this question, rather than just respond to them at face value.
Yeah, and I think they oversimplify the need or the ability for the company to make a change, either buy a product, integrate a product, because it changes the way people work. And if they're not familiar with that political and economic process, it's going to get stuck.
It almost inevitably, And it'll appear to us, because we're interfacing through somebody who's giving us positive signals that things appear to be moving in the right direction, but it's actually getting stuck internally because the champion is not well equipped to make or drive the case for change internally. If they've not been experienced in, and frankly, sometimes salespeople don't do themselves a great deal of service by sort of implying incredibly or uncredibly that all that you need to do is buy your solution and the problem solved. I think anybody who's driven a change project understands that there are risks, there are consequences, etc. And actually, I think, and I can't remember who came up with the research, there was some very compelling research I came across the other day that said salespeople who don't position that everything is inevitably going to be straightforward, but actually alert the potential customer to potential pitfalls, and then tell them how they'll work together to navigate around those things, are much more credible. And those issues are not necessarily, and very often they're not actually, technical issues with the product. They're challenges involved in any change management process.
And so what do you do with your clients? Is it the first step to understand how their customers buy the product?
Yeah, although there isn't a single formula for that, is there? But
No.
so there's a number of very useful things. And what I found is quite often the answers to some of these questions exist somewhere in the company. They're often inside the heads of the most effective salespeople. It's just that they haven't been very well articulated. Nobody's sought to, distill them into a form where everybody could learn. And I actually think one of the reasons why top performers are top performers, firstly, I think, sure, some element of it could be attributed to they have innate talent. Particular emotional intelligence or what have you. But I think it's also down to they're often high performers because they're really good learners. They work out what works and do more of it, and they work out what doesn't work and they stop doing it.
Stop doing it,
yeah. And that, and trying to work out what those lessons learned are is pretty useful. So the first thing I try and assess is, so what does an ideal customer look like? Or what does an ideal opportunity look like? And it's really a handful of things typically. One, it's an issue that we can prove we're really good at solving, and if recognized by the customer, will cause them to act. There's no point in chasing frustrating issues because you might get enthusiastic champion, but they won't be able to sell the case internally. So the issue's got to be significant enough that if recognized, the customer will be obliged to act. Second dimension then is, so what organizations have the potential to need those issues solving? And what I see very often is segmentation's done on a very naive basis. It's done primarily on demographics. Our target market are companies in this industry of this size in this location. But I tell you what, when you really, really dig into it, it seems to me that there are other things which tend to be much more valuable when predicting. The first element is, you might call it variously structure or attributes. What systems do these companies already have in place? Do they have a track record of only ever buying from top brands, or are they open to, buying from leading edge, best in breed providers? And there's a number of other things very often. So these factors tend to be unique to a particular vendor, but they're common across some of their best customers. And then I think there's behavioral aspects, and that's, for example, can I detect an appetite for innovation in this organization? Are they early adopters? Are they genuinely organizations that seek a partnership with suppliers, or are they very definitely motivated by they buy on least cost and on no other factor? So if you've got that sort of profile, you can then start to assess what sort of organizations you ought to be targeting. Next element is, so what are the roles within these organizations who are sufficiently powerful and authoritative and also responsible for the business problems such that they could lead the change agenda? Yeah, back to the discussion we've just been having, because it makes a hell of a lot of sense to proactively target people who are in the sort of roles that our past experience suggests, independent of the individual personality, but by and large, somebody in that position is a better chance of them being able to drive the internal change agenda. And then the fourth thing is really a timing question, and that's the issues, what issues, what organizations, what roles all sort of tell us, so who might it be worth us investing as a long-term potential prospect. And the timing thing is, so what's happening or what has just happened in that organization that might cause them to recognize now, when they didn't perhaps recognize before, that they need to change. and the most common one of that is very interesting and very predictable, actually, is change in senior executive leadership.
Yeah. And how about as far as interviewing those top performing reps? Because typically if you ask them, what are they doing differently, you don't get a real clear, valuable answer. You really have to dig down and go through each deal. Yeah.
Well, and it needs to be, and you need to ask the questions laterally often rather than directly.
Yeah.
And, ask them to retell some stories about deals they won. And, what were the moments of truth within those opportunities where they kind of had the aha moment. So I think as salespeople, we want our customers to have what one of my old mentors used to call the aha moment. It's the moment when, the customer, the prospect, gets it, gets the need for change, gets why you do what you do, gets that your solution could help them solve the problem. And I think also salespeople, the better ones, are sort of tuned in so they have some aha moments. They might have them of the moment, or they might look back and say, that was the point where I now realize the path to success was being laid. But asking these questions directly is much less effective than actually having a conversation, inviting them to tell you stories, and so on.
Excellent. Hey, Bob, I really appreciate your time today. It was a great conversation. Where do people go to learn more about your work and connect with you?
Okay, so I publish a website that is www.inflectionpoint.com, and that's INFLEXION-POINT. They can also reach me on Twitter at Bob Apollo. That's all one word. And I'd be delighted if any of the listeners would like to connect on LinkedIn. I don't think you'll find too many Bob Apollos out there. I'd welcome either a follow or a connection request, and I hope that they'll find something of future interest to them in some of the topics I choose to cover.
Hey, I wanted to thank you for listening to this episode of the Sales Questions Podcast. I also want to thank you for connecting up with me on LinkedIn. If you see any content of mine on LinkedIn, if you could like it, I'd certainly appreciate it. I also have a company page for each of the podcasts, The Brutal Truth, Sales Questions, B2B Revenue, and Career Advice. And check out my website at b2brevenue.com. Look under training. And check out the courses that I have. There's two that I think you'd be very interested in. One is Start the Conversation, Get the Meeting. This is the ability to get into almost any account. It shows you strategies. It's been out now for, 9-10 months. So there's about, 18-20 hours of office hours, case studies, examples, as well as the core content. You can pay per month or pay all at once. You can expense it in most cases. Most people expense it or make it smell like gas. But the key thing is it's not just videos. It's not just a self-paced thing. Yes, you can go in, sign up immediately, and not interact with me at all if you don't want to. But you can also get one-on-ones at no cost as long as I can share the content with the other students. Or you can pay for private one-on-ones. And you get office hours every other Friday where you can ask any question you want. You can email me at any time, any question or concern that you have, any examples that you want feedback on. And the same is true with closing the complex sale. Now, if you're in selling the complex sale and you're not making, let's say, $500K a year, you need to be able to understand where to go. And in the office hours, I will give career advice and point you in the right directions and tell you where I'm seeing people making the most amount of money, do an assessment of where you are now and where you need to be. But you need to understand how the complex sale really works and how to execute against it. And it's not just knowledge. It's the ability to understand where you are and where you want to get to and have somebody to help you along that journey. So that's the objective of the course. Again, they have the same type of format, office hours every other Friday. There's the core content. You can ask questions via email at any time or voicemail and send me examples. I put them up during office hours and review them. Of course, it's a living thing, so it's growing every week with new content, new feedback, new examples. And it's really a journey of investing a year of your life, say 1 hour a week, into becoming super good at your profession of sales. So it's not this 2-day course where you cram it all in and you forget it all. It's a journey, and you get a coach to kind of help you through the process. So check it out, and you can also schedule a call with me if you have any questions. Look through the table of contents. Make sure you're listening to at least 5 episodes of the Brutal Truth About Sales and Selling podcast to get a sense of, is this a guy that I want to work with for a year? Is it somebody I can learn from? Is it somebody I can connect with? If you want to talk to me, my calendar link is there where you can schedule a call, a 15-minute call, ask questions about the course, but please be serious. It's not a career coaching call or a sales coaching call. It's whether the course is right for you. I hope you enjoyed these episodes, and please connect up with me on LinkedIn. And tell somebody else about the podcast, and check out the other ones, The Brutal Truth and the B2B Revenue and Career Advice. Thanks for listening.
I love the approach. It's working for me just fantastic. If I sent you some of the emails, which I should, the conversations that I'm having with people, I think you'd be blown away because they're not really about work. Yeah. I've figured out if you can kind of get personal with them, like one lady, it's all about her family, kids. And then I sprinkled in a little bit around work, and she's LinkedIn, sending me messages on LinkedIn, photos of her family. No, I'm not even kidding. I should show this to you. You'd be stunned. I was shocked. And we're going to lunch on September 6th. And yesterday she shot me a LinkedIn message and said, "Hey, Ron, why don't we get on the phone and do a video call beforehand so our lunch isn't so awkward? We're like barely not meeting each other for the first time." Oh, holy cow, right? Like, this is unbelievable. So this is not the first time that this has happened. She's kind of an extreme, but I'm starting to figure out a pattern where I can actually make this a process, So
good. Yeah,
I'll show you that. So it's getting to that point. And every time I do this, I'm like, God, this is unbelievable, So,
and it feels better too, doesn't it?
Oh, Brian, let me tell you something. To be able to go to lunch with her. I'll even talk to her on the phone, right? We're going to talk about family, kids, work-life harmony, because I shared a thing with her from Bezos about work-life harmony. This is where the conversation will start. Now, at some point, we're both not stupid, right? We know we're going to talk about work. We know why we're both there. Right. But to kick it off this way is so much better. And to end that lunch with the last 5 to 8 minutes of telling, what are you guys doing with digital